Hi everyone and welcome back to my kitchen. I hope everybody's doing well. I can see from my social media feed that everybody's cooking up a storm. The pictures have been great, the comments and the dialogue has been great, so keep it up. In particular, I want to give a shout out to Barbara and Carolyn and Kelly, and in particular Scott and Beth. You guys have really been inspirational. Today's segment is about roulade. What is a roulade? Well, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a piece of pork today, although it could be any kind of meat that comes in a roast form, and we're cutting it so that it flattens out, and then we're going to put a stuffing inside, roll it back up, tie it off, and then roast it in the oven. So it should be fun. The first time I ever did this was with my friend Linda at Cambridge School of Culinary Arts when we were taking a class. I haven't done it for a long time, so let's hope that everything turns out okay. Let's have at it. So what we have here is a 2-pound-ish piece of pork loin. I have taken off all the ugly pieces, the silver skin if any, and left a little fat on there because you want to leave a little bit, but you don't want so much that it's going to be all fatty. What we're going to do here is we're going to cut this in a way that flattens it out, opens it up like a book. And so the way you start that is, first of all, you want a really, really sharp knife. I like to use a fillet knife for this because it's thinner and more flexible. Make sure that it's sharpened really, really well because you want to be able to just pull the knife through the meat. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take a cut that is about 3/4 of an inch up on the piece of meat, and we're going to pull it through evenly, parallel to the cutting board, and then start pulling back a little bit at a time and opening this thing up like a book. What you can see here is I'm taking a cut a little bit at a time, flattening it out, taking another cut a little bit at a time, flattening out. You do not want to cut all the way through, and you want to try to keep your knife as parallel to the board as possible. You can see here that what's happening is it's opening up and flattening out. So what we've got here is a nice flat piece of meat. Don't worry about these extra fat pieces here. We're going to go back and figure out how to get those to the same depth. And the way we do that is we go back where it's a little bit fatter than we want, and we cut through there and open that up a little bit, and we cut through here and open up a little bit, so that we've eventually got a piece of meat that's roughly the same thickness all the way through. And you can see here I'm just kind of evening everything all out. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, after all, this is something that you're just going to stuff with some meat, with some stuffing rather, and you're going to roll it back up afterwards. And if it gets a little messy on the first time, don't worry about it. As you can see here, I haven't perfected it. In fact, we get a little extra piece here that I'm just going to take off there. And now we've got our roulade. So let's take a view of this lengthwise. What's eventually going to happen is we are going to put our stuffing into this now flattened out piece of pork loin, and then we're going to roll it all back up like that and tie it off. So let's make our stuffing. Like most things that I try to talk to you guys about, it's really not about the recipe, it's really about the technique. I came up with what I'm going to do here for stuffing basically by just looking in my refrigerator to see what I had kicking around the house. I looked at a few other videos. In fact, this apple grating technique that I'm going to use comes from a video I saw by a guy named Scott Rhea. I like the idea, so shout out to him. We're going to use that. Essentially what's going into the stuffing is apple, which is a classic pairing with pork. I have some Parmesan cheese, some mozzarella cheese, because, you know, cheese, what else do I have to tell you? Some breadcrumbs. I've got some herbs and spices here. I've got a little bit of Italian seasoning, some fennel, which also is a great pairing with pork, especially with apple, and some hot pepper for a little kick. And then there's some garlic and the ever popular salt and pepper. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is grab this apple. You can see here that I busted my grater, and Amazon is promising to deliver me a new one sometime in this century. So let's take this apple here. We can leave the skin on because that actually leaves some cool flavor in it, and just sort of grind that up. And what we're really trying to get here is probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup. One of the things I want to tell you guys about the recipes that I do is I kind of look at stuff and I get a feel for what I think is the right amount of proportions for things. You know, you'll learn over time what is right for you, whether you like more pepper or less pepper, or more salt or less salt, or more garlic or less garlic. So I'm not going to be prescriptive about that. You experiment and find out what works for you. So now we've got some apple grated up. Let's get rid of this grater for a minute, and the rest of the apple, I'll make sure that the rest of that apple ends up in some other recipe. So let's throw that in the bowl first. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add in we've got some Italian seasoning, some fennel, and some crushed red pepper. There's about maybe a teaspoon of each are going in there. I've got 1 clove of garlic going in. We've got about 1/2 cup of Parmesan cheese, about maybe 1 cup of mozzarella because I want it to be nice and ooey gooey when I cut into this, and then some unseasoned breadcrumbs. If you've got seasoned breadcrumbs, that's okay too. Just remember that when you're doing your seasonings, to allow for the fact that they're seasoned breadcrumbs. Or another way to go is panko. I kind of debated in my head about which way I wanted to go, but I figured most of you out there probably had breadcrumbs and not panko kicking around. But if you do, that's a fair choice. Just take a pinch of salt in there, and then some fresh ground pepper, and give that a good mix. And the moisture from the apple will actually help bind this together a little bit. There's just enough moisture in there. You don't need an egg or milk or anything like that. But if you want to add that, that's okay. Again, this is a suggestion. It's more of a big hint than it is a prescriptive recipe. So, time to bring out our pork loin and get the stuffing, which we made just a minute ago, into the pork loin. Before we do that, it's really important that we season the underside of the pork loin with a generous helping of salt. And you're going to hear this from me over and over and over again. You need to salt everything as you go along. Salt is not about making it salty. Salt is one of those chemical reaction things that Al Brown would tell you about that really makes sure that the flavors of whatever ingredient you use come out. It will not make things overly salty to use salt as you go along. It will actually bring out the flavor. Where things get overly salty is when you actually add salt at the very end of the recipe and then all you can taste is the salt. It hasn't married with your ingredient. So if you salt while you're going along, you're going to have much better meals. We're going to throw a little bit of fresh ground pepper in there before we put the stuffing in as well. Let's get that so that we've got some nice flavoring going on there. And then let's add our stuffing. The way we're going to do this is we're going to sort of lay it down into the pork, and what we want to be careful to do is leave some room on the edges, because when we roll this up, what's going to happen is it's going to want to squeeze out a little bit. So put the pork stuffing in there pat it all down, get it nice and firmly in with a little bit. See, I've got a little edge here on the back and a little edge here on the front and on the side, and that'll help get an even distribution of the stuffing along the pork because it'll have a tendency to squeeze out. So now we've got all our stuffing in, and we're going to roll this bad boy up. So starting at the end that's closest to you, as tightly as you can, you can see already that this is going to have to be gently squeezed in to keep it all in there, is roll this back up into a nice roll, tucking the stuffing back in wherever it wants to pop out. And now we've got our stuffed pork loin. How beautiful is that? So our next step in the process is to tie this all off so when we cook it, it doesn't all fall apart. And so everything's kind of tightly together so that it cooks well. I've got some butcher's twine here. I've already cut up a few pieces, but just to show you, you really want to be very liberal with the pieces you cut before you tie this off. It is far easier and much less finicky to have a really long piece like this and then you trim it off at the end. And I also like to get all of my pieces cut up before I start this process so I'm not handling the butcher twine with the meat all over my hands. It's just one of those sanitation things. So the first thing you're going to do here is you're going to take this butcher's twine, slide it underneath, bring it up over the top. What I like to do is, there's many ways to do this. If you want to get into it, you can find endless videos online for whatever technique you want to use. I wrap it around, give it a couple of passes underneath, and then give it a quick tie. Easier said than done, like that. You don't want to pull it too tight because then what'll end up happening is you'll actually squeeze out the stuffing. So we're going to put another one of these in here. Let me show you this again one more time. Once through, twice through, pull it tight, give it a knot, and cut off the excess. So the next thing we're going to do before we get this bad boy rest a little bit is we are going to put a little more seasoning on it. And because we've only seasoned the inside, the outside still is yet to be seasoned. And you guessed it, we're going to put some salt on it. So I'm going to give it a liberal dusting with some salt. And don't forget to get the bottom, because unless you're not eating the bottom, that needs salt too. We're going to do the same thing with some pepper. Gonna hit that all over with pepper, turn it over, give it a little dusting of pepper there. And then what I've done is I've actually just sort of looked in my kitchen cupboard for what spices I had kicking around, because like everybody else here, we're all stuck inside and I'm going to use what I have going on. I'm using dried spices. Normally I try to lean into fresh herbs a little bit more rather than the dried, but what I have here is I have some Italian seasoning kicking around. I've got some garlic powder, some onion powder, some red pepper, and you want to try to lean into the same sort of seasonings that are in your stuffing. You don't want them fighting with each other, the inside and the outside. So I'm going to mix that up a little bit, and then we're going to dust our pork loin with that mix and all the way around here. You don't need to go crazy. We want the pork flavor to come out, but we want to give it a little bit of a kick and some extra added interest. So we're going to get that in there, and then the other thing, roll it around on the board so everything that you spilled all over your board gets onto the meat. And there you go. So time to get this guy cooking. We had it in the refrigerator for about an hour to give it some time to have the salt and pepper and all the other herbs and spices kind of get their way into the roast. And then I took it and I put it out on the counter for at least a half an hour, maybe an hour, to let it come up to room temperature. Why is that step important? Well, the thing is that you want the inner part of the meat to start to get a little bit warmer so that when you're roasting this, we don't get the outside all cooked and then the inside has to catch up sometime later, which will end up with the effect of uneven cooking throughout the meat. So a piece of meat about this size could really stand about an hour out on the counter, and I've actually had it about 45 minutes. So the next thing we're going to do while you are away, what I did was I chopped up some vegetables, and if you look at these, your standard array of aromatics. We've got some onions, some carrots, and some celery. If you watched my stock video, you'll have seen these vegetables before, and you're going to see them again in other videos that I do. So we're going to put those in the pan in the bottom for two reasons. One, I want to actually put the roast on top of them so that I get good airflow all around the roast so that we get good browning on every surface. And also, I'm going to try to make a pan sauce out of this after all is said and done to serve it with. And hopefully, if that all works out well, this will flavor the juices that come off the pork roast. So we're going to hit this with a little olive oil just to give it a little bit of way to get that started. Surprisingly shocking, I'm putting salt on it because everything you cook with needs to be salted. Put a little bit of pepper in there to get that going. And then for the roast itself, I'm going to hit this quickly with a little bit of olive oil on all the surfaces. Again, that's to get the browning started, that Maillard reaction that you want to be able to get that beautiful brown stuff. If you're a fan of Anne Burrell, you've heard her say 1,000 times, brown food tastes good. And so that's what we're doing here. So that's how we have it prepped before we get it into the oven. I have set my oven temperature for 350 degrees. There's a lot of debate out there as to the correct oven temperature for various roasting techniques. We're not going to go there today. We're just going to do 350 degrees. So when will this roast be done? Well, the guides will tell you that the time for this is 20 to 25 minutes per pound. So that would tell you that a 2-pound roast like this should be done in about 45 minutes. Well, I am going to go with a temperature technique, which is a much more accurate way of cooking. I've inserted a thermal probe into the middle of the meat, and I've set my alarm to go off at 135 degrees. Why 135? Well, we want the meat to be at 145, but if I have the alarm go off at 135, that'll call me back into the room so I can stop monitoring it, and then I can decide when to take out of the oven accordingly. So a couple of minutes ago, the thermal probe that I had set in the meat went off. I let it go to 140 degrees. And so you're asking yourself, Mark, didn't you tell me that you wanted the internal temperature to be 145? Well, yes, I do. I'm sure most of you know about the concept of carryover cooking. And so what's going to happen here is we're going to take this out of the pan, and I'm going to put it on this carving board here with the little slots on it so we get all the juices. And I'm going to let that sit for about 15 or 20 minutes, maybe even as long as a half an hour, so that the carryover cooking does its thing. The more important part of that is really what you want to have happen is you want to have all the juices from internal to the meat redistribute themselves to the outside of the meat. The heat, the physics of it, is the pressure from all that heat pushes all the juices in the middle, and what you need to do, that resting step, is really so that the juices can mingle in there and dance around with the rest of the meat and make it all happy. And we'll get back to this in a minute. So what you can see here is the vegetables and the drippings, and the brown stuff is that beautiful fond that you get when you roast something in a pan. I'm saving that, and I'm going to make a pan sauce out of it. So what I've done is I've taken the vegetables and put them aside. That's going to go into a saute I'm going to make in a minute. And I've taken the drippings and the fond and put that into a pan. I've added about a cup of chicken stock, reduced that down by half, and then add some cream and butter, and then let that simmer on the stove for a couple of minutes to get my pan sauce. Another side dish I'm making to go with this meal is some sauteed cabbage and apples. I have some cabbage sliced up, some apples, that actually reflects the apples that are in the stuffing for the pork, and some onions, as well as some caraway seeds and a little butter. I put that into a frying pan, sauteed it up, and then the vegetables that I had from the roasting pan earlier get added in because why throw them away? The last element of this plate is going to be a cauliflower puree. I've taken a head of cauliflower and I've broken it up and put it into a steamer basket, and I've steamed that until it's fork tender. In parallel, we have some heavy cream and butter in a saucepan. I've melted that down so it's nice and warm, just bringing it to a simmer. The cauliflower goes into a blender, and then it gets the cream and butter added, a little bit of seasoning, and that's all you need. let's get that all onto a plate and see how it all came out. I need my tongs here. Let's grab those. This has been resting for about a half an hour. Let's throw that. Let's cut through that first piece. There you go. That's cooked perfectly, and you can see here that we've got the stuffing all nice there in the center. How I can tell this is correct is we still got juices coming out of it. So cut up a couple of pieces of this. And then onto the plate, the way we're going to plate this is I'm going to take my cauliflower puree, which I made earlier. And we're going to do that fancy chefy swoosh thing on it. You know, get that on the plate. And then we will take some of our pork and lay that nicely on the cauliflower puree. And then we've got our pan sauce, which I'm going to distribute a little bit of that onto the pork. And then our cabbage saute. It's beautiful. It's amazing. The house smells incredibly well. If somebody figures out how to do that smell-o-vision thing, the world will be a happier place when it comes to cooking videos. So, let's give it a try. The pork is still really tender. I can tell before I've even put it in my mouth. Oh, it's great. There's the taste of the fennel, we've got the gooey cheese, the cream sauce is making it even moister than it already is. We've got some cauliflower puree, excellent meal. I hope you had fun looking at this video. I had fun making it. See you next time. Be well, be safe.